Welcome everyone to what I think will be a really special conversation about representation in healthcare. My name is Courtney Zhu and I lead the Venture Acceleration team at Matter. I oversee our portfolio of over 225 digital health and life sciences startups. Matter is a healthcare technology incubator and innovation hub. We help people and organizations transform ideas into solutions that improve the healthcare experience. At Matter, we do three core things. First, we incubate startups. Since we launched 6 years ago, we have worked with more than 500 companies at all stages of growth, from those that are still refining their go-to-market strategy, all the way to those that have millions of dollars in revenue. Our member companies are located all over the world, and we have a suite of services to help them build and grow their businesses. Second thing we do, we work with large organizations such as health systems, life sciences companies, and payers to help them advance their innovation goals. We help them source and co-develop solutions, think through complex challenges, and we have training capabilities to help them innovate better. Third thing we do, we are a nexus for people who are passionate about healthcare innovation and transformation. We bring people together to be inspired, to learn, and to connect with each other. We produce a lot of programs, including large-scale events for the broader community and small forums for our members and partners. In honor of Black History Month, we've invited two wonderful Matter startup founders who are here today to share how they're building both solutions and communities to create a more equitable healthcare experience and a more accessible pathway to entrepreneurship for underrepresented populations. While this event is taking place in February to honor Black History Month, it's just one part of our ongoing commitment to amplify diverse voices. Today, I am delighted to introduce two Matter members and CEO founders, Kistein Monkhouse and Javier Evelyn, and longtime Matter mentor, Dr. James Gillespie, who will be moderating the conversation. Kistein is a CEO and co-founder of Patient Orator, a digital health startup that is using a mobile app to enable patients to tell their story more effectively using symptom tracking and management. She is a nationally recognized patient advocate and former healthcare worker who saw an urgent need to address healthcare disparities in vulnerable communities. Javier is the co-founder and CEO of Alerje, a medtech and digital health startup dedicated to supporting people with food allergies. He's also a founding team member of Medtech Color, an organization aimed to advance the representation of persons of color in the medical device industry. He served as a Millennial Advisory Board member at First Independence Bank and was most recently appointed to the board of one of the fastest growing food allergy advocacy organizations in the country. Javier was recognized in 2019 on Crain's Detroit Business 40 Under 40s list. James, finally, is the executive director of the PRISM Institute at Sterling Bay, which aims to provide resources for established and emerging healthcare and life sciences companies. Dr. Gillespie is also a senior advisor at the Stanford University School of Medicine's Clinical Excellence Research Center in Palo Alto and a research affiliate at Yale University's School of Medicine's Center for Digital Health Innovation in New Haven. As the event unfolds, please submit your questions using the Q&A function. James will weave them into the conversation as we go. And with that, I will turn it over to James.
Great, thank you, Courtney. Great to be with everyone here. Thank you for attending. Just really excited to talk to these two great entrepreneurs. Courtney mentioned it's Black History Month, but these are great entrepreneurs, period, who just happen to be entrepreneurs of color. I've been pleased for many years to be a mentor at Matter, and Matter is a great organization that focuses on mobilizing a community of healthcare innovators to aspire heroic change. And as we get into today's conversation, I think you'll see Kistein and Javier are both pursuing heroic change. So with that, let's turn into the conversation. Kistein, well, actually, let's start with both of you. You're both leading innovators, healthcare startups. Courtney briefly gave your backgrounds, but if you could just add more context to that, that'd be great to start. Kistein?
Sure. Thank you so much for inviting me to be here, and thank you for the warm intro, both Courtney and James. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Kistein Monkhouse. I'm the founder of Patient Orator. I'm the creator of an award-winning documentary titled Humanizing Healthcare, which showcases the stories of people all across the United States as they share their experiences with poor health experiences and poor patient experience. I am a former frontline healthcare worker. I worked as a nursing assistant as I was pursuing my master's degree in public administration and public health. And I'm very excited to be here today and talk about Patient Orator, the application that I built subsequent to my experience on the front line.
Great. Thank you, Kistein. Javier?
Awesome. My name is Javier Evelyn, founder and CEO of Alerje. I'm a Chicago native, Chicagoland native. Chicagoans are watching, so I have to be specific. I made the switch over to, or the transition over to Detroit after coming across tech. Worked as a mobile application developer at Meridian Health Plan and RX. Learned all about the triangle offensive healthcare, your patients, payers, and providers, and how you need to really be cognizant of how you provide that value to all parties involved. And that background, in combination with the fact that I have a lot of food allergies personally, I consider myself a patient entrepreneur. So started Alerje. We're all about improving the lives of the more than 220 million people worldwide that are impacted by this life-threatening condition. We're starting things off with our flagship product, redesigned epinephrine auto-injector that has a better form factor for portability on the back of a phone case. We alert the right folks during emergency usage. And we have some regulatory progress that's coming soon. And we have a lifestyle mobile application, the food allergy specific, HIPAA compliant, only on the market in that space to our knowledge. And we have some other oral immunotherapy products coming as well too, in the digital space as well too. So super honored to be on this panel with y'all, and thanks again to Matter and crew for the opportunity.
Great, thank you. Great company name, by the way, Alerje. Very, very clever. So Kistein, let's start with you. It's always great to hear what inspires one to start a company. I know Patient Orator is doing so much important work to take this enormously complex healthcare system and streamline communications, help people understand systems, et cetera. Can you give us a sense of what your inspiration was to start Patient Orator?
Sure. I absolutely love talking about the inspiration behind Patient Orator because it is my lived experience. So while, again, going back to being on the front lines, I had a lot of time in my hand during my night shifts and would go into the rooms of patients that couldn't sleep and actually listen to them. I was one of the very few staff members who would do that. What I was hearing from patients firsthand was that their voices were not being heard. And these were people specifically that were underrepresented folks. So people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, people from racial and ethnic minority backgrounds, and people who live in an urban area. And so I was also pursuing my education in public administration and kind of quickly identified the overlap between high hospital readmission rates and the social, economical, political issues in our society as to why sometimes people come back into the hospital within 1 week of being discharged. But then once I transitioned into care coordination, that is the first time that I actually saw how big the gap was. Because for the first time, I was providing care for people or acting as that bridge for people who had numerous care gaps. So these are people who were housing insecure, but also needed to be connected to their doctors. And as their advocate, I had trouble really gaining the information that I need and really being that advocate for those patients. And so that is why I was prompted to found Patient Orator. To be quite honest, I knew I wanted to do something in digital health. I knew that the stories that I was hearing at bedside were so rich that they needed to be told at on a larger scale. And so we found it with this aim or goal to kind of broadcast these stories and have people be this voice to bring awareness to health inequities and poor patient experience. But along that journey, I became ill. And that is when I had the light bulb moment. And in my own experience, what I specifically experienced was suffering from chronic pelvic pain. And it took 3 years. It took a seventh doctor before I would actually receive prescription pain medication for my issue.
Seven doctors?
Seventh doctor, yes. It took the seventh doctor. It took 3 years. And then for the very first time, I took into account what we were doing. We were telling these stories, bringing awareness to these issues, but how are we really solving it? And the way in which I saw it was, if we have resource gaps or care coordination gaps, We have technology, right? This is a 21st century, and patients' voices are not being heard. How about we flip the script? How about we provide a formatted way in which people can document their medical symptoms? They can identify what their social needs are. Because in my communication with my doctors, based on who I was speaking to, the way in which I spoke was different. Sometimes fear is something that hindered my ability to communicate. Like, we're on a panel right now, like I may stumble upon words because I'm nervous, right? It's the same thing with medical interactions. It's the same thing, but it becomes even more intensified when we're talking about stereotype threats. When a Black person enters into a medical facility and their provider is white, and they, in their own heads, are being judged because of ongoing systemic racism that exists. So really the goal was to provide this safe space where people can document changes in their health through this HIPAA compliant mobile application, and be able to communicate that. Our long-term goal is to really integrate that information into the EHR system so the provider can have the data that they need to treat that patient clinically, and then to really direct them to the appropriate care coordination that they may need.
That's great. And Kistein, even as an experienced healthcare worker, you're saying as a young Black woman, you felt intimidated on the patient side?
Absolutely. I have a master's degree, and I think after a while of seeing multiple doctors and being told that there's nothing wrong with me, it becomes something that's embedded in your psyche. And I don't want to generalize, but for me as a young Black woman, that is something that I experienced. Because if over and over people are saying there's nothing wrong with you, just go home. Like, I was in the emergency room, I got discharged, I was told just go home and let it be. But then once I was in a crisis, and then I actually saw the appropriate provider who would take the time to listen to me in a humanistic way and gather the information that she needed, to then say to me that, listen, Kistein, you have normalized pain. This is not okay, right? And then pointed out that I'm just one of the many few women that experience pain at the level that I do, and have been dismissed by providers. So yes, to answer your question, absolutely.
Very compelling. Javier, let's pivot, talk about your inspiration. I think you spoke to that, your own allergies, but maybe you can talk to, starting a new company is a big deal, a lot of work, stress, fundraising, market fit, et cetera. So what motivated you to translate your own, personal struggles with allergies into actually starting a company?
Yeah, I ask myself that question all the time. It's a crazy ride in a good way, right? No, but all jokes aside, kind of just like Kistein just mentioned, right? You experience the problems and you have a unique set of perspectives that when we think about other industries, whether it's entertainment, sports, et cetera, we tend to uplift and upgrade every single industry. So I've always thought that healthcare is the last frontier. Again, having food allergies specifically was the main reason. I remember being at a dinner party saying, yo, it'd be great to just have like a EpiPen or anything like it, an auto-injector to on the back of your phone case for just to kind of make life easy. And I kind of got some pretty cool responses, and I said, let me run and put this in the basement real fast and start working with the right folks. And then when we started to look into the research, saw a huge audience, a huge worldwide market, 220 million people worldwide impacted. But as I look into some more research, we found that Black and brown children, a study by Dr. Gupta out of Northwestern mentioned that that's the fastest growing population that's impacted for the same reasons, ironically, that Kistein just mentioned. The social determinants of health, it plays a real big role in that in the first place. So I thought with that combination, that gumbo of information, we can do something pretty special. And then secondly, I was inspired by a lot of the consumer health companies, or just consumer companies in general, right? Think about like your smart watches or your smart, I'll say thermostats really, right? You have hardware that essentially is like a Trojan horse to some awesome software that can really enhance a typically pretty mundane experience. We wanted to kind of double click on that and just kind of copy and paste it in the healthcare sector. Obviously, it's not as cut and dry as that. So the way to kind of make that happen was to kind of figure out what's the tribe you have, right? So from reading the Stanford Biodesign book, my background was working in healthcare as well, but more so from a PBM and health insurance standpoint, really building tools for those different stakeholders. When Kistein mentioned the care coordinators, we built tools around those as well too. And that really helped to kind of put the last piece of the puzzle around. There's a framework that we can build around to ensure that we hit the right marks, not just for the patient of today, but of tomorrow, right? So we always, one of our core values at Allergy is proactive patient-driven design, and that's rooted in empathy, right? Making sure that you're having the conversations with your patients, your caregivers, any stakeholder to ensure that we're aligned. We're thinking about this because, you know, I'm sure we'll talk about this, but by the year 2040, Black and brown folks will be the majority population of the United States. So it ain't just a matter of just kind of like, in addition to what we talked about so far, it ain't just about just the handouts that other folks want to give in. It's more so about building for the future of tomorrow, the America of tomorrow, that is. And I think that combination is really what inspired me specifically as well.
Absolutely great. Now, Javier, you mentioned social determinants of health. That's a hot phrase, right? Every journal I open, you see the SDOH, sometimes small o, sometimes big O, but you see it. What does that mean to you, that phrase, particularly in terms of allergy?
Yeah, for us, I think about accessibility of the medication, right? So number one, the cost right now across the board, it's gotten a little better with some generics that are out there that have less than favorable designs. And I'm just coming at it from an entrepreneur. I'm wearing my orange hat, the allergies, so I'm a little biased. But when you talk with folks, it kind of sticks with that first. And then secondly, the education process. You know, I've spent time on different parts of Chicago, but mainly I've had a couple panels or have gone out to the east side of Detroit to have conversations with ECE populations. And, you know, you have folks saying, yeah, my kid has a milk allergy. And then we dig in deeper and we find out that they're feeding them, you know, cheese pizza later on. And it ain't because they want to harm their kids. It's because of the lack of understanding across the board of how this condition really kind of works in the first place. So from our perspective, obviously it's mapped against the studies that are out there that shows the writings on the wall, the misdiagnosis, obviously that's out there. The underdiagnosis of food allergy is huge right now. And then that combination really kind of, for us, from our perspective, I think proactive patient-driven design is kind of rooted in that. I think it's lowercase o personally when I write down social determinants of health. That's why I laughed at that. But at the end of the day, that's kind of like my thought process on it as it relates to allergies, specifically in our niche that's growing pretty fast these days.
Excellent. We're going to pivot here in a second to talk about race, which you both experience and feel every day. I do too. But I want to remind folks that please ask your questions in the chat box or the Q&A section. And Kistein, we actually had a question for you from Sheila, and she asked about your product in terms of security and cost.
Sure. So our product is HIPAA compliant and follows all the regulations as required. And in terms of cost, that's one of the things that we're still working on. And we've had to do some pivots based on the early feedback that we've gotten from our users.
Great. Let's talk about race. We talk about that a lot these days as a country, even now, probably not enough. Want to ask you what it's like to be entrepreneurs of color, especially African American. I think the issues that African Americans or entrepreneurs are, the challenges and opportunities are greater in both buckets, especially those challenges. Javier, I'll start with you, and maybe talk about this in two parts. One is just building and cultivating networks, connections, potential clients, et cetera. And then the second bucket is that crucial fundraising piece. We know the statistics for VC dollars, PE dollars flowing to African American-led entrepreneurs is anemic, it's pathetic. So can you talk about those two buckets, Javier? And then Kistein will ask you the same thing.
Yeah, it's a huge one. It's even worse, I feel like, in healthcare at times, but I don't know the specifics on our healthcare investment dollars. But I think there was an article by Crunchbase that said something like out of $150 billion last year, after, you know, George Floyd was lynched, even after all the different programs that were earmarked for Black and brown folks, there were still real big gaps. There was a lot more hashtags Black Lives Matter than, you know, wires sent out to Black and brown founders that are the future of today and tomorrow. So 1% of that going, that's, you know, under 1%, 0.67% of funding going into those folks. My experiences have been, you know, it's been, these days it seems like it's sweet sometimes because, you know, you get a little, you have your ups and your downs, but the reality is that first funds we ever went after, it was like a $7,000 check, man. And I'm talking about, it felt like $7 million. We went after it 3 times. It was through a state-based program. It was a good feedback loop to kind of get clarity on that. But over time, it was only a matter of, we continually had to prove that we were worthy of that next step over and over again. And I brought this up on another conversation recently. I found that pitch competitions, unfortunately, was a way to kind of hack it. but that's not sustainable. You can't build a business off of pitch competitions. That's literally a band-aid for the lack of funding that's out there. From a biz dev perspective, I would say that getting in a room has gotten better because I got some great mentors. I know we'll talk about Medtech Color, but I'll just kind of highlight a couple folks like Kwame Omer, Vanessa Pollard, Nada Eve from Johnson & Johnson, and the like. And just being able to like get in the room with those individuals to kind of see how they maneuver, how they are able to pay it forward. I think one thing that we got to kind of hold an accountability within our own folks is that sometimes different generations don't always open that door for the next and upcoming person. And I think that's the difference that what we're trying to do with Medtech Color. It's an open door policy. There's no good old boys or good old girls club, right? We want to make sure that everybody has an opportunity to have access to not just the funding, but also to the folks that can actually buy your product. Patient Orator is amazing. When you think about what she's solving, like literally that is amazing. That's building for the future of tomorrow. So my experience it's been a mixed bag most recently, but it took, what was it like I've been doing it full time since 2017. And I'll say since that, it feels like we're just getting to that point where folks are starting to take you seriously, and that's infuriating. But at the same token, it's one of those things where it is what it is. The darker you are, the harder you work, they say. But what that does is builds up your strength, your muscle to take on any and everything. So I like to say, lastly, my mom raised me to put water, or growing up, she put water in the eggs to stretch things out. We're able to make a lot with a little, right? But moving forward, that should change. We need to have adequate resources. And I believe that certain things are starting to change in terms of those conversations, investors, but we need less tweets and more wires.
Yeah, great. Actually, Javier, I was going to ask you how you prevent that experience where you're having to jump over hurdle after hurdle after hurdle. Instead of becoming embittered, you've actually channeled that productively. Not that you're looking to keep jumping those hurdles. you want to be a level playing field. Kistein, same question to you. Just overall, is a African American founder, and then particularly in terms of, and someone asked this question in the chat box, that VC, venture capital, and private equity side of things.
Sure. So echoing most of what Javier mentioned, our experience is very similar. For sure, in our previous talk together, I just had to commend him on his strength and his ability to go out and hustle the way he has. But I should say that I exist at the intersectionality at both being a woman, both being Black, and being an immigrant. Women founders, first of all, 3% of venture capital. Black and Latina, 1%. I understand the uphill battle that is in front of me as an entrepreneur of color, right? But I am in this because I understand the importance of being in this space, developing and creating for people that look like me. One of the first, I would say, health tech meetup that I'd gone to, I was the only Black woman in the room. I was one of 3 Black people in that room, and one of very few women in that room. And understanding what fear and anxiety came over me because I was a minority in that room. And I kind of understood the issues that were ahead of me. On the other side of that, pitching to investors who were not culturally competent to understand the need of the technology that we were building. And here we are, COVID-19. It angers me that people are hashtagging social determinants of health. But when I was pitching back in 2018 about addressing for housing insecurity and addressing food insecurity and empowering the voices of underserved populations, no one cared. But now, all of a sudden, we have COVID-19, and people are realizing that COVID-19 has exacerbated healthcare disparity. Well, if we are more preventative in the way we think, and the solutions that we build were more diverse in the people that we let into the room, we wouldn't have these issues. And so that's where my journey has taken me. Luckily, I haven't given up and have had the support of other industry stakeholders who have allowed me to kind of create content for them in that way. And that has allowed me to then use that capital and then put it into the product development that we've done. So very untraditional from what you would hear in VC and in tech world, but that's the kind of path that I've taken.
Great, thank you, Kistein. Peter asked in the Q&A section, he asked, what have you found are characteristics of the people that are receptive? You're talking about your medical care. It took you 6 physicians that weren't listening. That 7th one, she actually listened to you. What are those VCs that you're finding? They actually listen to your story and they're interested in investing in your company.
If I had found the VC that was interested, I would have
Not yet.
probably been venture backed,
Okay.
right? I think
Sure.
the problem is being in this early stage. It's a very awkward stage for startups, right? Because you need to have metrics in order to be funded. You need a pilot program in order to prove to an investor that, listen, this product is clinically validated. And if you don't have the network behind you to then open those doors to those health systems, then you're kind of stuck in this place. And so my journey has taken such a long time, and it's primarily because of the fact that there's no funding. Had we had funding, our product would have been developed 2 times as fast. Had we had some sort of angel investor who had the network, then the doors to those pilot programs would have been open, and things would have been a lot faster. But as an entrepreneur, I've learned that very early on, I was speaking to the wrong audience. If you don't understand what health inequities are, you're the wrong person for me, first of all. And so I've had to take into account some of the things that I was doing wrong and kind of approach differently. And so now, as we're thinking about investment in the long term, we're thinking about people who are in that social impact space, people who are at that early stage. And then the other part of that is dissecting what does early stage mean, because when they said, oh, you need an MVP in order for us to take you seriously, I went back, I bootstrapped for a year, came back with an MVP, and now what? I need clinical validation for this product. So it's kind of being stuck in this rut. Hopefully that answered the question.
It does. I have a friend, and he actually helps. He's Caucasian, but he helps minority entrepreneurs. And he says he goes to funding sources and they say data. He said, here's the data. They say, well, data is not everything, right? So they kind of move the goalposts often. So Javier, you mentioned in the chat section, Medtech Color, if you can talk about that. And, I have found that African-American and other entrepreneurs of color, not only do you run companies, but you end up giving back in so many other ways as mentors and starting organizations, et cetera. But can you talk to this great organization you're part of?
Well, first off, I want to make a comment on what you mentioned. You're preaching, man. I feel like a lot of virtually all Black and Brown early stage startup founders have to live while they climb. It just comes with it comes with the seed. Now, I'm honored to do it. I think Kistein is doing the exact same thing by the work she's doing. But Medtech Color is for us, right? It's supported by a bunch of allies across the spectrum. The ability to kind of, I would say, number one, we know the tech industry is crazy in terms of diversity numbers. It's really underrepresented in terms of funding, opportunities, et cetera. It's 10x, in my opinion, when it comes to medical device, digital health, et cetera. So really creating lanes and opportunities to ensure that we get more representation of Black and Brown CEOs, C-level folks, executives at these large companies, so there's no glass ceiling. We want to help you break through that in the first place. Relationship, mentorship is part of it. We recently had a huge pitch competition that's really going on right now. Amazing application. Sponsors selected some amazing folks for us, backed by Johnson & Johnson, ResMed, the California Health Foundation as well, among others, to ensure that we can start to build that pipeline, because there's lots of quote unquote medtech and digital health startup organizations that just don't have the numbers yet. So we want to make sure that we, number one, can be the example, be the change that we want to see in the industry, one, and hold folks accountable by example. So that was one. Prior to that, we've had, I think now, 3 Medtech Color breakfasts. It's basically just a gathering of allies and supporters and leaders in the space. The last in-person event we had in Philadelphia, we had the CEOs of Stryker and Medtronic sit at the table with us to literally redefine what their approach is from a D&I, diversity inclusion perspective. And we're not talking folks that they're just putting out statements, like literally making sure folks move up the ladder. We see that happening. There's some things going on with AdvaMed Excel as well, a great organization that's looking to diversify a bit more for early stage medical device startups like myself as well, to ensure that we move the ladder as well too. So it's a combination of providing that framework of support, mentorship, and opportunities towards getting involved with the Kisteins of the world, that literally she has the a third of the funding, a fourth, an eighth of the funding that other companies get in the first place. She takes off. Insert rocket ship emoji 3 times right now, right? Because that's what happens when you start to fund the right folks right, that are doing the work at this point. So,
yeah, well, great. Well, let's pivot. We don't want this all to be negative, which is great. It's a very positive conversation. But let's talk more explicitly about opportunities that you guys feel as Black and Brown founders, as Black founders. What are the opportunities? What does that perspective bring to the table that others don't? Kistein, you want to start? And Javier?
Sure. So Matter has a CEO forum for women of color, and we recently had this discussion, and it seemed like we were all hitting a brick wall when it came to pilot programs, right? It's such a low-hanging fruit for healthcare organizations to open their doors to startups that are women-led or solving for health equity. We know how urgent these issues are, yet it seems as though there's no way into these systems, which is very critical if we're really going to address these issues. So I think that's one of the first things that we can do, or the industry can do. On the other hand of that, I would say there are so many barriers when you look at, for example, I had a conversation with a very reputable organization in the Medicare space. They were thrilled about what we've built. They were excited, they loved it, they wanted to get on board right away. But the accelerator program that they were working with, they were the betters. They were the ones that were holding the keys to the door in order for us to get to that organization. And so what happens then is our organization applies to that accelerator program, but the judging criteria for the tools that comes through those doors are not exactly applicable to health equity solutions. So you can't have the same judging criteria for, let's say, something in digital therapeutics as it will be health equity, or a health application that solves for health equity. So I think that's one of the things that needs to happen, where if your organization is going to really open its door to healthcare innovation, and Black and Brown founders and people from the community that are actually interested in building for improving health outcomes, then you really have to sit back and say, how can we lower some of these barriers that we have, so founders can actually gain access to our organizations. So that's one of the low-hanging fruits I think that can be done.
Absolutely. And Kistein, just to follow up on that a little more, just as an African-American female startup leader, what perspectives do you think that you could bring to the table that is an opportunity for you, actually?
So I have the lived experience of being a Black woman and not being heard. I also have that lived experience of being on the front lines and seeing patients whose voices were not being heard. I think those are things that are not to be undervalued. They're incredibly valuable. In fact, if you look at diversity and inclusion and how basically the higher up the ladder you go, the less diverse it is, then that's very telling to the glass ceiling that exists. And it trickles down to the experiences of the patients that walks into those rooms, walks into those healthcare system. And if you have someone like myself or other people who are from the community that have the expertise that can then say, this is what you need to do to improve outcomes or improve the way in which people experience your healthcare services, that is, I think, something that is valuable. Hopefully that answered the question.
It does. Yeah, great answer. Javier?
I want to double down and just kind of give a shout out to Matter, not because we're on this panel, but they've been a great partner. I think they're one of the most underutilized, I'll say, organizations in healthcare. They've been a great partner for Medtech Color's pitch competition as well, too, just by way of just whether it's infrastructure support or whatever else we need for the most part. But to double click on what's been talked about, definitely the pilot programs, without a doubt, just to ensure that there's real pipelines for the innovation to grow and thrive. But another area that we kind of see report-wise that's underfunded, we talk about the funding because a fifth of the GDP spent, roughly a fifth of the GDP spent in healthcare. So it's a big market. There's money out there that needs to be distributed equally. And when you think about the Triple H, the NIH, the NSF grants, there's a even worse representation when it comes to folks getting past getting approval in the first place. So let's have an open conversation about why that's the case. It's our voice is not being heard in that case as well, too. So I think it's a combination of that, making sure that we have multiple pipelines towards whether it's coming from early stage startup VCs in the first place, but quote unquote, the NSF I think is a great organization, but they're calling themselves America's Seed Fund, and we represent the America of 2040 and 2050 and beyond. So I think once we start to kind of close that gap in that type of dialogue, special things will happen. I'm not going to sit here and preach and say you sprinkle money on us, things will just happen, but you provide opportunity. As others have in the first place, on a continuous, consistent basis outside of February, right? Short as month and year, then special things will definitely happen for sure.
But you wouldn't mind that sprinkle or deluge, right?
A little salt-based sprinkle, yeah, a little bit, yeah. But then right. It comes to
Yeah. Javier, you mentioned the majority Black, brown population are moving towards. Maybe both of you could talk about what impact do you think that has on your companies, on our healthcare system, or in our country?
I think it's our superpower, not just because we're led by a Black founder, but I just want to make sure, like when I go to Thanksgiving back in the day, in a different world, it looks like United Nations. I'm Afro-Latino, so I grew up in a household that had everything from Celia Cruz to Bob Marley to Aretha Franklin, right? So just being able to have diverse voices, perspectives, and culture add, not culture fit. I stole that from dual security out of Michigan. Just having a different perspectives to kind of lend towards innovation. So you're building with empathy. If you don't know the person, I'm not saying if you're not Black, you don't know my struggle, but I'm saying I might know a little bit more than you, right? Just because of that. But the other side is the opportunity, because we get into, I think in our pre-call, we talked about not talking about the Black struggle, but talking about the Black genius more than anything else, right? Just being able to highlight what we're doing from a high level, putting folks in C-level positions that can, as an example, we just brought on an amazing chief marketing officer to help tell that story from the perspective that is unique to us, to take it to a different level. So I think there's a lot of different ways to go about it, but having a team that's rooted in, again, diverse leadership is super important to ensure, because there's lots of studies and I'll say surveys coming out for some of the top or emerging medical device and digital health companies in terms of what that looks like. And it's not surprising. It still have a lot of work to do in that capacity. But once we solve that, I'll say it this way: the same energy we give towards like a lot of the consulting firms to work on certain specific problems, allocate that energy and budget towards organizations that are doing stuff with bootstrap budgets. Lots of nonprofits are doing this as well too, to ensure that we can have the discussions to ensure that we get the right leadership out there. I'm kind of rambling that last point, but I really feel it's all about diverse leadership more than anything else.
Absolutely. And Kistein, the same question to you as we move to a majority Black, brown. I would think that creates lots of opportunities for Patient Orator. What are your thoughts on that?
No, I think echoing what Javier just said, yes, there's lots of opportunities. Like we're uniquely positioned to address so many gaps in healthcare, not only for underrepresented folks, but also for our providers, right? There's provider systems that need data to better treat folks. So on that end, we're positioned to address some of these bigger population health problems. But taking it a step back, I think when we look at representation and why it is important in the healthcare industry, we had Dr. Martin Luther King in 1966 stating that of all forms of health inequity, of all forms of inequities, healthcare inequity is the most shocking and the most inhumane. Here we are almost 55 years later, and we're having discussions about health inequities, about poor health outcomes. And I think that's very telling of how slow the industry moves, but even more so, how important it is to have representation, how important it is to have diverse voices, how critical that having that representation may help to prevent premature deaths of Black and brown folks. It may help to prevent deaths of low-income communities, our elderly, our disabled, our LGBTQ communities. These are the type of representation that we need, right? And if we're not moving the needle and we're continuously having conversation about the need rather than actually addressing it, then the system is blatantly stating that they do not care about the outcomes of the people that I just mentioned previously.
Great summary. Kistein, you actually anticipated my next question, which is, how does this actually, the things that you face, the structural racism, how does it actually work itself out into suboptimal outcomes? Javier, I asked you the same thing that Kistein just teed up from an allergy perspective, or just more broadly. What are actually the consequences, the person in the waiting room or at home or et cetera, of these issues that you see?
Well, I think there's a bottom line issue down the road. Again, not to harp on the same point, but we're building for the America of the future. We think about, so again, going into just the Black and brown population being the fastest population that's acquiring food allergies at a very fast rate over the last couple of years. Like that's a huge issue. And I think, again, going back to one of our core values around proactive patient-driven design, that's rooted in empathy. And again, empathy is, I believe, the superpower that a lot of Black and brown founders just kind of have by design, because I think it's what's the art of double consciousness. You're always thinking about yourself in the condition and those of the other as well too, in terms of like what they're thinking about you, et cetera. That's something we need to kind of shed and kind of highlight to ensure that we can build better tools for the future. But I think it's just double clicking on the same conversation. And really, beyond that, I think it's just a matter of ensuring that not just those voices getting a chance to kind of have a voice at the table, but really just getting the funds out there as well too. So I hate to be a broken record, but there's certain conversations that after a while, I'm kind of taken aback because Kistein just mentioned that Dr. King quote, and I'm like, wow, we're talking about 50 years later and it's the same conversation. So what do we need to do that's like taking small steps is not working. Large steps, fundamental changes to the system in terms of the healthcare system need to be kind of addressed at this point. And it's bigger than having the panels all the time, right? I mean, we have to be real. That's the same amount of opportunities that we get to sit on panels. We need to be able to sit in a room to have a pilot opportunity, right? Just if you can get away, eliminate the funding part, right? Let's have direct pipelines towards commercializing certain products, and not just to be the Rooney Rule, for lack of a better phrase, right? We don't want to just be a check mark to say you interviewed someone that can have that same innovation. So I think when we start to, take that approach, I think you're going to start to see a fundamental change in the pipeline of innovation that's going to affect not just our communities, by the way, also, because we do build, by the way, our markets are not niche. These are markets that extend beyond into the rural areas as well, too. We have folks on our team that come from North Carolina as well, too, right? So having that type of background really allows you to really build for a more cohesive version of what we're talking about in terms of the United States.
Great. We're going to shift here to technology in a second, but I had a question in the Q&A box, and I was wondering this too. Just drilling down a second on this issue of access to venture capital money. I know one of the issues is you don't have diverse funders, right? Just last week, I got a flyer on an event in Austin, 28 people listed. So 7 down, 4 across, 28 males, can you believe it? All males. 26 Caucasian, there are 2 Asian Americans. Amazing. That was last week. But in terms of VCs, how much of it do each of you think is racism by the person? Is it benign stereotyping? Is it just ignorance? How would you kind of break that down, what you're seeing out there? Just to go down one more level before you pivot, on what's the actual barrier there? Kistein, you want to start, and then Javier? It's a tough question, but yeah.
Yeah, it is really a tough question. Sometimes I'm in room with people that are Ivy League educated, and I wonder, maybe I needed to have an Ivy League education in order to be accepted at some point in time previously. But I really don't know, right? Because for our Patient Orator specifically, we're solving for health equity, right? We want people to be heard. We want the information that is not captured in the 4 walls of the healthcare system itself to be portable so that the patient can be empowered. We're not solving for something that people are unaware that doesn't exist. At this point, we know that it exists. So what is causing the issue of non-funding? I'm not sure. Being a person of color, whether that means it's a lack of representation in those boardrooms themselves, being someone who doesn't come from money, so to speak. I really don't know. If I had the answer to the question, and perhaps I would understand how to navigate that space. But I think that continuously hustling, continuously showing up, and not being discouraged by the fact of what that number looks like from a funding standpoint, that is the importance of continuing down that journey, and not being so focused on the why. I think the industry has to figure that out. And if we can do something on the policy end to kind of regulate, to make sure, like NIH grants, that they are reaching the Black and Brown founders that are from the communities, that's another way of looking at it, and not being thirsty, so to speak, for venture dollars.
Great. Javier?
Yeah, I agree with what Kistein said as well too. I think just accountability metrics. I think right now there's too many, like literally, I think there's been lots of tweets and lots of conversations going on recently around like, let's just kind of post out what the diversity numbers are, right? It's cool to have conversations and panels and things of that nature. Let's just put stats. I think that numbers don't lie. And when we start to see who's doing what, and I think there are some emerging, I would say, reports that are coming out for certain funds. I haven't dove into all of them. I see them at a high level. But once you see that, we can kind of start to address it piece by piece, because there are some, let's just keep it real, there are some firms that look like that still every now and then, from a numbers perspective, they invest more than others into Black and brown folks, and those are allies, right? And there are others that just do a lot of talking and posturing, and that's not healthy for the industry whatsoever. So once we get to a point where we can kind of say, hey, here are the numbers, this is the ranking, this is the true metric that should be included when we talk about top VCs or top investors. What does that look like? Because you're not being responsible when it comes to the type of dollars. A lot of the, I'm not super versed on this, but I think when it comes to VC, there's like certain, when you think about like the funds that basically like your public workers, essentially the retirement funds.
Right.
I don't know.
Pension funds.
Right. Yes, the pension funds
Yeah.
essentially, right? Lack of sleep last night. But your pension funds essentially that go towards these VCs that are primarily being funded in different parts of urban centers like, the LAs and Chicago's, are going to fund folks that don't look like us in the first place. That's a huge problem right there. So if the funds are coming from us in the first place, then there needs to be accountability specifically for that. If the LPs don't look like us, then hey, maybe it's one of those things where we can kind of just try to hold them accountable. But I think the key is accountability. But like Kistein said, if I knew the answer, it'd be a different panel. We'd be talking about, how to back swim into money at that point. But we have some work, and it's founders shouldn't have to fight that themselves, because that's another fight in and of itself. But we're here for that reason.
Well stated by you both. We only have 10 minutes left. I want to make sure we cover technology, and then we should talk about COVID. Kistein, we'll start with you. Technology, powerful, right? Empowering. It can bend the cost curve, all the great stuff we know about technology. Historically, though, it's been a double sword, right? For communities of color, especially African Americans. It actually can widen gaps, widen disparities. As a tech entrepreneur, a healthcare tech, what's your perspective on technology and its power, as well as, frankly, the potential danger of it?
Sure. So I think let's just acknowledge that technology is necessary at this point. And that is incredibly powerful to move data and to get the outcomes that we need in this country. But even as a tech entrepreneur, being a person of color, I recognize the importance of being accountable and being transparent, especially for the population that we're solving for. So even from the design standpoint, taking it a step back, before we even created wireframes, we had mock-ups of what the technology would look like, checked in with the population. Would this be something you would be interested in? Yes. The response was overwhelmingly yes. Throughout that process of designing and creating, continuously checking in with the patients, continuously checking in with providers and social workers, kind of getting the input from everyone involved, and also addressing some of those security questions. I think it was Sheila who earlier asked, what about security? And so those are the things that we were very conscious about very early on in creating the tool that we have created. But let's not forget that it's important, or digital health is incredibly important to get people the resources they need and help them, especially in our case, to have their voice be heard.
Great. Thank you. Javier, on tech.
Yeah, for our upcoming product that we have centered around oral immunotherapy, right now that's a specific space in food allergy that when it comes to underrepresented minorities, there's not a lot of us in that in terms of the FDA approved products. Sometimes awareness, this is a treatment that can potentially help reduce the severity of a food allergy. So to be able to have a product that is informed by not just the population that can currently afford said treatment, let's make sure they're involved in the decision-making process. So like Kistein mentioned, again, proactive patient-driven design, making sure that you're getting in front of the patient at all times and having different conversations. Is this cost accessible in the first place? That's a very important factor to kind of know what that V1 or the first version of your product is going to look like, how it's going to be paid for, who's going to pay for it. Because again, you got that triangle offense of healthcare, your patients, payers, and providers, and making sure they know about the different options that are out there. So that's one thing. And on the other side, the underutilization of epinephrine during food allergy anaphylaxis is really high in that same patient population that we aim to serve. So We need to build our tools in a way that kind of fit in the background, so you can go from brunch selfie to whatever you're doing at that time to, oh my God, I ate a peanut pistachio. In a couple of seconds, inject yourself, and the right folks are automatically notified of where you're at, what you're allergic to, and how to save your life. That's when you start to bake in the patient of all, I would say, patient populations, all slices of it, that is. Into that, I think special things start to happen from a design standpoint and from a just build out perspective. I think you can do things really awesome.
Great, great. We have two more questions. One is Sheila asked this one. Sheila, you're the star today. She's asking a lot of great questions. We would be remiss if we didn't talk about COVID-19, right? And its impact on you as founders, you as human beings, the implication for your two companies. Kistein, let's start with you, the impact of COVID-19.
So pre-COVID, I was doing a lot of networking and getting Patient Orator's name out there. Of course, obviously with travel bans in place and things like that, kind of had to slow down on that front. But what COVID has done is kind of validated the need for the existence of our tool. Because like I said, in 2018, when I was pitching for solving for social determinants of health, people didn't know what food insecurities were. They didn't know about these other issues that exist. And now we're in an era where everyone is aware of health inequities, of healthcare disparities. So I think what's happened is that because of the shift of awareness of what these underlying health issues are in our population, we are better positioned now than we were before. From a funding standpoint, there hasn't been much of a difference because until there is dollars in the bank account, there's really no changes there. But yeah, I think that there's been good and there's been bad, and there's been the in-between, and the hustle continues.
Yeah.
The hustle continues. Yeah, I was going to say
Yeah.
The hustle continues is the name of this panel, because that's really what this is about. No matter what, you continue to innovate in spite.
But has it been good for you, COVID-19? Has it been, it's a bad thing, obviously, but from your company standpoint?
Yeah, for sure. So I'll get into that. So at the end of the day, at March, when things started to kick off, this is a transparent story. Like the day before my birthday, I had to let my team go temporarily. I didn't know it was going to be temporarily at that point. It was the first time in our company's history where I wasn't able to pay a check at that point for a pre-rev startup that was kind of, again, hustling to make sure you hit the next milestone. We were able to kind of acquire some funds through a PPP. I was one of the few Black-owned companies that I know to get that. I had a Black banker. I think that had something to do with it. And also just come across random pitch competitions to be able to kind of get to that next milestone. And then from there, we kind of saw, I have a newsletter I send out on a monthly basis to a lot of stakeholders. And a lot of folks saw that story and said, if y'all can bounce back from something like that, you may be interested in this opportunity that's international. So we came across and were introduced to an EU-based grant. Essentially, that's kind of like the NSF or NIA's cousin that's up to like $2 million potentially at this point. I thought it was just too good to be true, but over the last couple of months, we put the final touches on it. And that's a huge opportunity that's transformed a lot of different opportunities for us. That also, in between that time period, we were recipients of a couple other grants, want and pitch competitions. So it really forced us from a fundraising perspective to kind of move in a different area and look in different parts, different buckets that I never really thought about. I never really thought about the international funds that are out there that want to fund anything, right? In terms of innovation, they're not really considering like what you look like, not all the time. The other part is that oral immunotherapy product that I mentioned. That was something where at the beginning of last year, the very first pharma company in that space got FDA approval. A couple months later, they were acquired. And we saw a lot of gaps in the game in terms of a lot of blind spots in the treatment of care. So it's already within our niche market. That was a huge opportunity for us to kind of focus now with limited resources on what we had to focus on to get something that we can commercialize this year while waiting for FDA approval for our device. So it really helped us pivot. One of our core values is to adapt and attack. And we exemplified that in 2020 for sure.
Great. Kistein, someone asked in the chat box where they can find your documentary. If you can type that in, that would be terrific.
Sure.
And then Bridget, that'd be great. And Bridget asked, if you just name one challenge that African Americans face in healthcare, quality, access, lack of autonomy. Javier, we'll ask you first. I know it's hard, but you can just name one. What do you think is the biggest challenge? And then we'll ask you the same thing, Kistein. Yeah, first, Javier, what does he think is the biggest challenge, Javier? Yeah, I think Kistein.
I think it's what Christine's working on right now. I have multiple women in my family, Black women in my family, that have come across the exact same conversation that she's talked about. And it's crazy. Like, it's frustrating as a man when you are, or your spouse, your brother, et cetera, or just a family member in general that runs into that same conversation. So I think that's number one, the pain not being respected, because that's causing a lot of long-term harm for a lot of other folks. A lot of people are not always fortunate to find that right doctor. So I think that's number one right now in our space.
I agree. It's that respect thing, trust. Yes. Kistein, there are many. If you just had to name one, what would you say it is?
A lack of humanism. We do not value people that are from underserved backgrounds. And, you know, the lives of people who don't necessarily look like the people that are making the decisions in our country, it's not valued in the same way. So Black and Brown folks, people that are disabled, if we are to humanize their existence in this world, humanize their existence in this United States of America, I think perhaps then we can see a shift, both from funding and everything else beyond that. Until we start humanizing folks, we're going to continuously have this conversation.
Very well stated. I'm going to ask you both to end. If there is one piece of advice you can provide, it's very pithy, that'd be great. Kistein, we'll start with you and then Javier. And just by the way, I want to put a quick plug in for I'm also co-founder of the Center for Healthcare Innovation that I lead with Joseph Gasparo. And we address many of these health equities and health disparities issues. And so that's another resource both for these two entrepreneurs and for the broader ecosystem. So as we wrap up, Kistein, what's we want to end on a positive note, right? Because you guys are both inspirational. This is an up or not a downer, but what's one piece of advice you'd give to other entrepreneurs of color?
One piece of advice, if you are designing for health equity, remember that the healthcare system had plenty of time to eliminate the barriers that we see in care for underserved communities. Still, here we are 55 years later after Dr. Martin Luther King's speech, and we're still dealing with this issue of inhumanity and inaccessibility of healthcare. We're fighting for racial, social, economical, and political health justice for the have-nots. Remember that every part of this process excludes us as entrepreneurs of color, and that the weight that we have to carry is heavier than those with privilege and power. But we cannot lose sight of what needs to be done for the sake of humanity, for the sake of racial equity, and for the sake of health equity.
Great. Javier, that's tough. That's a tough one to follow.
No, I got to keep it simple and short because I want to make that like something I believe
Well
that
stated,
I agree 100%.
Yeah.
I would say taking the lesson, there's in the startup journey, there's lots of L's you take. And I always say this all the time, you take that L as a lesson and not a loss. And that's how you keep the evergreen mentality to ensure that you continue to learn from whatever it is, whether it's slight against you or something you had to work on as a founder, your company, your business. And that's what allows me personally to propel through a lot of the barriers that we've talked about today. To walk out of this conversation happy and optimistic, regardless of all the crazy things we've talked about today. I literally feel like from Kistein's company to our company and a lot of the other founders I've been able to talk with, that the future is absolutely bright and this is our moment, and just keep stay the course because you know, at the end of the day, the innovation will have its place as we continue to have these conversations, yes, but also just do the work.
Great, thank you. Yeah, one has to leave this conversation very positive and optimistic, hearing the passion, energy, and knowledge you both have. So want to thank you. Want to thank Matter and the great work it does. Want to thank Casey and Courtney, the great team over there. And thank you to the audience for joining us for this important discussion. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.